the Vikings who changed Europe forever. They appeared suddenly out of the fog, narrow ships with dragon heads carved into their prows, gliding against the wind and reaching places no other fleets could reach. An hour later, where a thriving monastery had once stood, there was nothing but ash and silence. Before the Vikings, Europe fought wars differently. Armies took weeks to assemble, and invaders usually remained on the lands they conquered. The Scandinavians shattered that pattern. They struck fast, took everything of value, and disappeared before their enemies could organize a response. Over the course of 3 centuries, they did far more than spread terror. They founded duchies, gave rise to powerful dynasties, and helped shape an entire state in Eastern Europe. This is the story of how scattered bands of Scandinavian warriors became one of the great forces that redrew the map of the medieval world. Who were the Vikings? The word Viking originally did not describe a people. It described an activity. The term was associated with going on a sea expedition, while a Viking was someone who took part in a raid or trading voyage. People did not become Vikings because of their ancestry. They chose the life themselves. They were free farmers, younger sons who had inherited no land, and ambitious leaders searching for wealth and glory. Organizing an expedition required serious resources. A chieftain had to gather men, prepare ships, and secure the support of powerful nobles. After a successful raid, the spoils were divided according to established rules. The leader received the finest share, while the rest was distributed according to each warrior's contribution. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were not yet unified kingdoms. They were territories divided among numerous kings, chieftains, and jarls. This helps explain why different Scandinavian groups expanded in different directions. The Danes moved toward Britain and France. The Norwegians crossed the North Atlantic toward Iceland, Greenland, and eventually the shores of North America. The Swedes traveled east, following the great rivers toward the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Why did they leave home? The answer was not simply greed. Scandinavia was a land of harsh climates, poor soil, and limited territory suitable for farming. Land often passed to the eldest son, leaving younger sons to search for opportunities elsewhere. Add to this the political fragmentation of Scandinavia, with constant conflicts between small kingdoms and rival rulers, and periods of worsening climatic conditions and failed harvests. Going on an expedition was not merely a way to survive, it was also a path to social advancement. A generous leader who returned home with treasure strengthened his power and reputation. A brave warrior could return with wealth, fame, respect, and perhaps even marry into a noble family. The first blow, Lindisfarne. On June 8th, 793, unfamiliar ships appeared off the coast of northeastern England. Armed men landed on the island of Lindisfarne, home to a wealthy and virtually defenseless monastery. They did not come to negotiate. Within hours, the monastery had been looted. Some monks were killed. Others were taken away as slaves. The target had not been chosen by accident. Lindisfarne was wealthy, poorly defended, and located directly beside the sea. The attack became one of the first major Viking raids recorded by European chroniclers. The shock was enormous. To some contemporaries, the violence seemed like a sign that the end of the world itself was approaching. And then the pattern repeated. Britain was politically fragmented. Rival kingdoms such as Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia lacked unified command. For Viking raiders, it was an almost perfect target. On the European continent, they discovered another weapon: rivers. They sailed along waterways such as the Seine and the Loire, bypassing fortifications and striking deep inland where no one expected them. From raids to conquest, the Great Heathen Army. In 865, everything changed. The so-called Great Heathen Army arrived in Britain, according to later legend, led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. This was no longer a small band of raiders. It was an organized military force with logistics, strategy, and a very different objective. Within a few years, York had fallen. East Anglia was conquered, and its king, Edmund, was executed and later canonized as a saint. Most of Mercia also collapsed. Only the Kingdom of Wessex, under Alfred the Great, managed to survive. The conquered territories eventually became known as the Danelaw, a vast region where Scandinavian laws and customs held enormous influence. The Vikings were no longer coming simply to raid. They had come to stay. The Siege of Paris and the birth of Normandy. In 885, an enormous Viking fleet sailed toward Paris. According to Frankish chronicles, the attacking force may have included hundreds of ships. The city, defended by Count Odo, resisted for almost a year despite hunger and disease. Eventually, Emperor Charles the Fat chose negotiation over destruction. The Vikings were paid a massive tribute in silver and allowed to move on. Odo, meanwhile, became famous for his defense of the city and would later become king. A quarter of a century later, the Frankish crown adopted a different strategy. Instead of endlessly fighting the Vikings, it would make a deal with them. In 911, King Charles the Simple granted land near the mouth of the Seine to the Viking leader Rollo. In exchange, Rollo accepted the king's authority and converted to Christianity. Normandy was born, a duchy whose very name came from the Northmen. Within a generation, Rollo's descendants were speaking French, but they preserved much of the military organization and warrior culture of their Scandinavian ancestors. That combination would eventually change the fate of England itself. Eastward, the Varangians and the rise of Rus. While Danish Vikings attacked the west, Swedish Vikings traveled along the rivers of Eastern Europe. They followed routes through the Volkhov, Dnieper, and Volga rivers toward the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Here, they were interested not only in conquest, but in trade: silver, furs, slaves. According to the primary chronicle, Slavic and Finno-Ugric tribes invited a Varangian prince named Rurik to establish order among them. His successor, Oleg, captured Kiev and helped unite the great trade route connecting Scandinavia with the Byzantine world, the famous route from the Varangians to the Greeks. Historians continue to debate how literally this story should be interpreted, but archaeology confirms one important fact. Scandinavian presence in places such as Ladoga, Novgorod, and Kiev during the 9th and 10th centuries was real. The Varangians gradually became not merely foreign warriors, but part of the ruling elite of the emerging state of Rus. Their journeys continued even farther south. They reached Constantinople, the magnificent capital they called Miklagard, the Great City. The Byzantine Emperor Basil II eventually formed an elite military unit largely associated with Scandinavian warriors, the Varangian Guard. They became famous as the emperor's personal protectors, renowned for their loyalty and ferocity in battle. How the Vikings fought. The greatest strength of Viking warfare was not numbers. It was speed. A relatively small warband could assemble quickly. Their longships could navigate shallow rivers and land warriors in places where defenders never expected an attack. The spear and battle axe were among their most common weapons. The shield was not merely protection. In formation, it became part of a coordinated system of pressure and defense. A sword, meanwhile, was an expensive possession, a symbol of wealth and status. And then there were the legends of the berserkers and Ulfhednar. These warriors were said to enter a terrifying battle trance before combat, but the surviving written sources describing them were often recorded much later, particularly in Christian Iceland. For that reason, historians treat the more dramatic stories with caution. Rather than supernatural madness, these traditions may have involved ritualized aggression and intense psychological preparation for battle. Everyday life and the role of women. Away from the battlefield, Scandinavian society was built around communities of free landowners known as bonds. Disputes and political matters could be discussed at public assemblies known as things. Women in Scandinavian society possessed legal and economic rights that could be remarkable compared with those available in many neighboring societies. They could inherit property, manage households and estates, and widows could exercise considerable authority over family property. Divorce was also possible under certain circumstances. And despite their popular image as permanently filthy warriors covered in blood and mud, Scandinavians placed considerable importance on personal grooming. Archaeologists have discovered combs, grooming tools, and other personal items in numerous burials and settlements. Regular washing and grooming appear to have been common enough to attract the attention of their neighbors. The Old Norse tradition even associated Saturday with washing, a bath day. Faith and runes. The Viking worldview was deeply connected to the idea of fate. According to Norse mythology, fate was woven by the Norns near the roots of Yggdrasil, the great world tree. Not even the gods could completely escape what had been destined for them. To die bravely in battle could mean being chosen for Odin's hall, Valhalla. But perhaps even more frightening than death was being forgotten. Reputation and memory could outlive the individual. For a warrior society, a name remembered after death could be worth more than life itself. Runes were more than simply a writing system. They appeared on memorial stones, weapons, and amulets. And in the world of Norse belief, runes could also carry symbolic or magical power. Words mattered. A name carved into stone could preserve memory for generations. And the right words, spoken or written correctly, were sometimes believed to have the power to influence the world itself. The end of the Viking Age. Knut, Harold, and Hastings. By the 11th century, Viking rulers were increasingly fighting not for treasure, but for crowns. The Danish king Knut the Great built a remarkable North Sea empire, ruling England, Denmark, and Norway. Unlike the raiding armies of earlier centuries, his realm possessed administration, laws, taxation, and the machinery of medieval kingship. But after Knut's death in 1035, his empire quickly fragmented. The last great attempt by a Scandinavian king to conquer England came from Harald Hardrada of Norway. Harald was no ordinary king. He was a veteran warrior who had served in the Byzantine world and had connections to the famous Varangian Guard. In 1066, he landed in northern England with an invasion army. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, however, his forces were defeated. Harold was killed. His death is often considered one of the traditional markers of the end of the Viking Age. But the story did not truly end there. Only weeks later, England was invaded again. This time, the conqueror was William, Duke of Normandy, a descendant of the same Viking leader Rollo, who had received land in France more than a century earlier. At the Battle of Hastings, William defeated the English king and seized the crown. The conquerors were no longer Vikings carrying axes from open longships. They were Norman knights carrying banners and coats of arms. The circle had closed. The descendants of northern raiders had become Europe's new aristocracy. The legacy of the Vikings. The Viking Age did not end with a single defeat. It ended because the world around the Vikings changed. Fragmented territories became centralized kingdoms with permanent institutions, stronger armies, organized systems of law, and a powerful Christian church. In this new world, there was less and less room for the independent warrior who gathered companions, boarded a ship, and sailed away in search of fortune. But the Vikings did not disappear without leaving their mark. Their legacy survives in the names of English towns, in the history of Normandy, in the formation of medieval Rus, in the ancestry of modern Europeans, and in political and cultural connections stretching across an enormous part of the medieval world. In just 3 centuries, the Scandinavians transformed themselves from sea raiders into settlers, merchants, rulers, and knights. They did not simply attack Europe, they became part of it. And in the process, they helped create a map whose outlines can still be recognized today. Thank you for watching.